David Rivers boarded Flight 894 from Zurich to New York without saying much. He didn't need to. His presence was quiet, unremarkable by design. No assistant, no luggage handler. Just a man in black jeans, a plain shirt, and well-worn sneakers. He walked directly to seat 1A in first class, sat down, pulled out his phone. Nothing about him stood out, and that was the point. The cabin crew didn't recognize him. Carla Dawson, lead flight attendant, clocked his attire and posture before she even asked a question. "Sir, I think you may be in the wrong cabin," she said. David didn't flinch. He handed over his boarding pass, ID included, green light, verified. But Carla didn't look, not carefully. "I'm afraid that seat was reassigned," David asked calmly. "Reassigned by whom?" No response. Zach Morgan, younger crew member, stepped forward, smirked. "Probably some mix-up with the system. You sure you're supposed to be here, man?" David simply held up the pass again. Carla took it this time, scanned it, still green. She narrowed her eyes, turned to her crew tablet, tapped a few times. Then, with one swipe, she deleted David's name from the passenger manifest. "System must have glitched," she said, and turned her back. This wasn't confusion. It was a decision. Lena Torres stood nearby, just a trainee, not cleared to intervene. But she'd seen everything, and what she saw didn't align with policy. The scanner had confirmed seat 1A. The name matched. The ticket was real. She quietly opened her voice recorder. A few rows behind, two passengers had taken notice, Olivia Bennett and James Cole. Frequent flyers by the looks of them. Olivia whispered, "That wasn't an accident." James was already recording. No commentary, just footage. David stayed seated. Not confrontational, just observant. Watching the way the crew moved around him, the glances, the decisions, the choreography of exclusion. He didn't argue. He made a call. "Rachel, confirm who's on shift for 894. I need logs pulled in the next 10 minutes. Rachel, his assistant, didn't ask questions. She just responded, "Already on it." Because David Rivers wasn't just another passenger. He was the CEO of Altura Air, a 25% shareholder, and for 3 weeks he'd been traveling anonymously to test how his airline treated people who didn't fit the first-class image. What happened next would leave 3 employees jobless, a trainee promoted, and a flight delayed by more than just time. From the outside, it looked like a minor boarding mix-up. A man directed to the wrong cabin, a crew enforcing policy, a simple reassignment. But the truth was less convenient. David Rivers had followed every rule. He'd checked in early, presented valid ID, and scanned into seat 1A without incident. Yet the moment he took that seat, it became contested. Not because of a clerical error, because of optics. Carla Dawson didn't consult a screen before objecting. She didn't reference the manifest. Her reaction was based entirely on what she saw, or rather, what she assumed. Sweatshirt, jeans, no watch, no briefcase. She read David Rivers as out of place and acted accordingly. Zach Morgan didn't challenge her. He added to it, smiling, mocking, escalating. His body language wasn't that of a concerned professional. It was that of someone enjoying the control. They didn't pause to confirm. They didn't ask questions. Instead, they moved quickly to erase the evidence. David's name, which had appeared clearly on the seating log moments earlier, vanished from Carla's tablet. "System error," she claimed. But it was human input that made it disappear. Meanwhile, Captain Eric Wallace stepped in, not as a mediator, but as an enforcer. He listened to his crew and not the evidence. His words were laced with corporate detachment. "You're interfering with FAA protocol." As if that phrase could justify ignoring a scanned boarding pass and a valid ID. And then there were the Langleys. Victor and Sophie walked into the cabin mid-scene, guided to the very seat David had paid for. There was no confusion on their faces, only quiet entitlement. They sat down without hesitation, without asking questions, without caring why the seat had suddenly become available. But other passengers cared. Lena Torres, still new in uniform, noticed the contradictions. She'd seen the green scan, heard the whispers. Something felt off, so she recorded, not with intent to disrupt, but to protect the truth. Olivia Bennett saw it too. So did James Cole. Both started filming. Within minutes, social media took notice. What began as murmurs of concern became momentum. The cabin's attention turned, not toward David as a problem, but toward the crew as a liability. David Rivers remained calm, centered, unreadable. But beneath the surface, the dynamics had already shifted. What looked like enforcement was actually exposure, and the clock had started ticking. There was no outburst, no dramatic confrontation, just a growing silence that felt increasingly unstable, the kind of silence that sits between a mistake and its consequences. David Rivers hadn't moved from seat 1A. He didn't need to. Around him, the situation had begun to evolve on its own. What started as a misjudged glance and a torn boarding pass had now become something less controllable and far more public. Lena Torres kept recording. She didn't know what would happen with the footage. She only knew it needed to exist. The green scan, the seat deletion, the crew's tone. If no one captured it, it would disappear just as quickly as David's name from Carla's tablet. And it wasn't disappearing. Carla Dawson began to notice the weight of the cabin turning. Conversations were shorter, movements slower. She stood tall, but her body language had shifted. Less assured, more guarded. Zach Morgan, once brash and comfortable, now paced slightly. He glanced at passengers more often, then quickly away. Outside the cockpit, Captain Eric Wallace hadn't returned. He'd issued his final statement. To him, the situation was resolved, internally documented, ready to be logged as a behavioral disruption. But documentation was happening elsewhere. Olivia Bennett uploaded a second video. This one showed the exact moment David held out his boarding pass, the green confirmation light blinking clearly. Her caption was short. He didn't raise his voice, they erased him anyway. James Cole's post followed within a minute, cut together with a timestamp overlay. Seat 1A, manifest screen, Carla's hand, swipe, delete. The edit was clean, sharp, unforgiving. Meanwhile, Victor and Sophie Langley were seated quietly in what had been David's place. They sipped champagne, their conversation unaffected by the tension around them. If they knew what had happened, they didn't show it. David remained still. He wasn't waiting for someone to step in. He was waiting for the system to reveal itself completely. Because this moment, this precise moment, was why he had boarded this flight without warning, without announcement, without visible status. And it had worked. Inside Altura Air headquarters, Nina Brooks was already fielding calls. The comms team had flagged the videos. A trending spike was forming. Legal requested time codes. Public relations requested silence. Operations asked the one question no one wanted to answer. Who was working that flight? Flight 894 was still at the gate, not for mechanical reasons, not for weather, because policy had collided with exposure, and exposure was winning. Time was no longer moving in minutes. It was moving in decisions, small, silent ones that stacked up like weight on a failing structure. David Rivers had not spoken a word since his boarding pass was torn in half. Yet every second that passed pulled more focus toward him. The cabin wasn't hostile. It was tight, compressed by awareness. And that pressure was starting to fold inward. Carla Dawson moved with the routine precision of a veteran crew member, but her body was tense. The silence of the cabin had changed shape. It wasn't just quiet. It was watching her. Every walk down the aisle felt longer now. Every set of eyes she met seemed to know something she didn't. Zach Morgan stood at the beverage station, head down, fidgeting with glassware. His earlier confidence had dissolved into hyper-awareness. He wasn't talking. He was calculating, wondering if the videos were spreading, if his voice had been captured, if his smirk was now public evidence. Captain Wallace stayed in the cockpit, shielded by protocol and routine. But the walls were thin. He had been briefed. And now he understood the mistake wasn't just procedural, it was personal. They hadn't denied a customer. They'd profiled a co-owner. In the back galley, Lena Torres hadn't moved from her corner. She kept her phone on record. She hadn't decided what to do with the footage, but she knew why she was capturing it, because the truth had already been rewritten once. It wouldn't be rewritten again. At Altura Air HQ, the response was no longer optional. Nina Brooks had assembled a response chain within 14 minutes. Crisis protocol was triggered. Public-facing teams were briefed. Legal teams had begun pulling employment records. Carla Dawson and Zach Morgan's incident history was being reviewed. Both had prior soft warnings. Nothing that had reached the board. Until now. The digital reach of the moment expanded. Olivia Bennett's video passed 200,000 views. James Cole's edit was featured on 2 news sites before the flight even taxied. The captions weren't speculative, they were declarative. CEO removed from his own seat. Watch what happens. And still, David Rivers did nothing. No statements, no demands. He let the footage speak, let the moment unravel under its own weight. The plane remained still, a symbol of delay, not mechanical, but moral. Flight 894 was no longer a departure. It was a decision point, and time had run out. The wheels hadn't moved, but the clock had, and time was no longer on Altura Air's side. Inside the sealed aircraft, David Rivers remained in place, not as a protest, but as proof. His silence had become heavier than any confrontation, and the system that tried to dismiss him was now being forced to answer, step by step, frame by frame. Carla Dawson stood near the forward galley, arms stiff at her sides. She hadn't received formal notice, but she had read between the lines of the call she'd taken. Her access badge would still open the jet bridge, but it wouldn't unlock anything else after landing. Zach Morgan knew it too. He'd reviewed the footage on another passenger's phone during beverage service, saw himself on camera, heard the words he'd said, watched his own smirk as he deleted someone from a seat they had paid for. No amount of procedure could rewind it now. In the cockpit, Captain Wallace's update was brief. We've been asked to delay pushback. Corporate communications is handling a verification matter. He didn't explain further. He couldn't. Because the moment he used the phrase verification matter, he knew who he was talking about and what it meant. Back in New York, Nina Brooks was now operating in executive mode. Her presentation to the board was complete, a clear, time-stamped chronology. Footage synced from 4 passenger devices, log activity from the crew tablets, security footage from the gate, access logs from the deletion screen. The conclusion was beyond dispute. Altura Air had attempted to erase one of its own founders based on appearance alone, and had done so publicly, digitally, and with total confidence in being unchallenged. David Rivers had challenged nothing. He had simply waited. The story, already viral, had spread beyond consumer outrage. Business analysts, shareholders, and media outlets were dissecting every frame. It wasn't just a customer incident anymore. It was a brand audit in real time. In seat 2C, Olivia Bennett refreshed her screen. Her video now had 1.8 million views. James Cole's version had crossed 3.2. The comments were sharp, the verdict clear. He built the airline. They erased him anyway. And still, David didn't speak. Because this wasn't about noise. It was about what happens when power forgets it can be held accountable. And today, it was. Flight 894 landed at JFK just after 9:30 p.m. local time. The cabin lights came on, seat belts clicked open, overhead bins opened, passengers gathered their belongings, but no one forgot. The silence that followed the wheels touching down wasn't relief. It was reflection. Because something had happened in that cabin that didn't fit neatly into flight logs or incident forms. David Rivers stood, collected his things, and walked off the plane with everyone else. No security, no confrontation, no explanation. Just a man stepping out of the system that had quietly tried to push him out, and failed. At corporate, the post-mortem had already begun. Internal teams worked overnight to isolate decision points. Every click that led to his removal was traced. Access logs, shift rotations, profile histories. Review cycles were reopened, policy exceptions reevaluated. A meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, Flight 894, immediate risk assessment. 3 employees were suspended pending final review. One director called it a preventable culture event. Another called it a brand fracture. The media didn't wait. Headlines ran the next morning. Founder removed from first class. Altura Air faces backlash over viral seat incident. Editorials followed, think pieces, explainers, threads dissecting procedure, profiling, and power. David offered no comment, no interview, no tweet, but his absence from the conversation said more than any statement could. In the days that followed, Altura issued a revised internal training protocol, mandatory review of discretionary enforcement, AI-based boarding integrity checks, whistleblower channel updates. They didn't credit David, but everyone inside the company knew why the changes happened. Passengers from that flight continued to speak online. Some wrote long reflections. Others simply posted, "I was on 894. That was enough. The story no longer needed framing. It lived in the raw footage, the silence, the slow response. David had never needed the seat. He needed the reaction, and now he had it, not from the crew, but from the structure they worked within. A system tested, a system exposed, a system forced to evolve, whether it was ready or not. The jet was emptied. The footage lived on. And Altura's future, from that day forward, had a new checklist: policy, perception, accountability. David Rivers didn't need a camera to prove what he already knew. He had built Altura Air on precision, not perception. But somewhere between expansion and prestige, the precision had eroded. What happened on Flight 894 wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. A live demonstration of how a trusted brand could quietly betray its own principles when no one thought they were being watched. He hadn't intervened because he didn't have to. The process exposed itself. Every tap on the screen, every assumption made, every bypassed verification, documented in sequence, unrehearsed, irreversible. He didn't correct the crew. He studied them. Because the value wasn't in confrontation. It was in evidence. The kind that forces change without press conferences or lawsuits. The kind that forces executives to explain how a co-founder could be erased from a seat he paid for, on an aircraft he helped design, by people trained under policies he once approved. But those policies had drifted. They were no longer frameworks of fairness. They were tools of discretion. And discretion, in the wrong hands, becomes a filter. David walked away with more than a lesson. He walked away with leverage, no shouting, no social post, just a locked file submitted to compliance, a silent trigger that shifted Altura from brand to case study. Policy reviews were no longer theoretical. System audits were no longer quarterly. They were immediate, invasive, and permanent. The fallout wasn't punitive, it was structural. Department heads were replaced. Internal vetting procedures rewritten, bias training re-engineered, and none of it carried his name. Because this wasn't about credit. It was about control, restoring it where it had silently vanished. He didn't dismantle the company. He realigned it, quietly, precisely, without ever stepping outside the very process that failed him. The next time a boarding pass scans green, there will be no second glance, no deletion, no correction, no. That is the legacy of Flight 894, not scandal, not spectacle, just systemic reform, triggered by a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Not all lessons are loud. Some speak through small decisions, quiet resistance, and the courage to wait. David's journey reminded us that dignity doesn't demand attention. It earns it. And when a system listens, it grows. If you believe in the power of story to reveal, reflect, and reshape, make sure you're subscribed. Leave a comment, like the video, and join a community that values truth, even when it whispers.
Stay.